Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live session at the Reactor. My name is Rav and I'm the program manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, please be friendly, please be professional, and please do ask questions. The chat will be open throughout, and we do encourage all of you to participate. So we're back with another episode of 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals. Today is the 9th episode. The series contains 10 episodes, and we are on the 9th episode today. I have put the playlist in the chat, so if you have missed any of the previous episodes, please feel free to go onto that playlist and scroll through all those videos which have been already delivered by Johan. We will be speaking more about the exam vouchers during the middle of the session. Johan will discuss how you can participate in getting an exam voucher. So please stay on and enjoy this episode of Azure Management Tools. And with that, I'm now going to add Johan to the stream and let him take it all away. Hey, Johan.
Hello. How's it going, everyone? I hope everyone had a great weekend, at least, and a great week so far. I certainly wasn't training yesterday, so went quite well yesterday, and I started training this morning. But welcome to episode number 9 of 10 Tuesdays. I'm pretty excited about today's session for the simple reason that we're talking about a bunch of management tools, right? And the more tools you have in your tool belt, obviously, the more capability you're going to have, and the better at the end of each day you're going to be able to manage your environment, right? So my name is Johan Meiber. I'm a Azure technical trainer, or a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. If you haven't seen the slide before, I've put my contact details there. I put my Twitter handle there, as well as my LinkedIn profile. So you are more than welcome to connect with me and even ask me some questions if we don't get around to your questions towards the end of this call. I'm originally from South Africa, living in the UK now, just outside of London. Love water sports, love anything to do with mountain biking and getting the bike as dirty as I can. So without waffling any further around that, today in episode 9, the second last episode, we're going to be looking at some of the tools that you might be using to manage your Azure environment, right? Now, of course, there's many types of tools, and there's many sort of folks that come from many diverse backgrounds that might be using sort of, different types of tools. If I think, for example, for a minute of a Linux administrator, might be more sort of, comfortable using a command line type tool with something like Bash scripts, whereas a Windows administrator might be a little bit more comfortable with, using something like PowerShell. If you're talking about developers and your DevOps type resources, they might feel a little bit more comfortable with infrastructure as code, and to that end, they might be using something like ARM templates, or even something like Microsoft Bicep, which is comparable to Terraform and some of those other third-party tools. What we'll cover today is essentially the Azure Resource Manager, what it is, why it's important to understand the Resource Manager. We'll talk a little bit about ARM templates. I'm not going to go into a great amount of depth there, but I will deploy at least something. And then I'm going to, we'll cover a little bit of PowerShell, touch a little bit on the CLI, and last but not least, we will, look at the Azure Portal and the Azure Cloud Shell. If you're not familiar with the Cloud Shell, it's probably one of my favorite tools in the Azure Portal environment. And then lastly, we will look at Azure Arc, what that is, what the benefits is of that. And let's get going. So when you're managing resources in Azure, for example, provisioning resources, removing resources, reconfiguring resources, guess what? It's not really you doing this, right? You might be instructing the platform to be creating a resource, but suffice to say that you've effectively got a proxy inside of Azure. You've got you've got a piece of glue there that keeps everything together and manages the life cycle of these different resources, right? And that proxy of yours is known as the Azure Resource Manager. If you take a look at the screen here, you'll notice that whatever tool you are using, right? And if I was using the Azure Portal, PowerShell, CLI, or even if I was programmatically coding the capability, right? I'm talking to the REST API, because that's also possible. You will typically be instructing the Azure Resource Manager that will check your permissions from an authentication and authorization perspective. You'll be instructing the Azure Resource Manager to do the deployment on your behalf. So when you're using the portal, for example, the Azure Resource Manager will first validate your deployment, implying that it'll check your permissions, implying that there's not an Azure policy or something like that that might stop the deployment from happening, and it will then go ahead and do that deployment, right? Some of the benefits of having the Azure Resource Manager is it manages the life cycle of resources as a group, doesn't necessarily concern itself with individual resources. It looks at these resource groups that you've got your resources in, and it manages the life cycle, and it manages those resources individually. If you, for example, placed a lock on the resource group, just as an example, and someone tries to delete the virtual machine out of that resource group, it is going to be the Azure Resource Manager that notices that there's a lock at the higher level and stops that resource from deploying the virtual and from deleting the virtual machine rather. It also is cognizant of dependencies between resources, right? So the Azure Resource Manager is quite comfortable with your ARM template, which is essentially the infrastructure as code that you might use to deploy your resources. It's quite comfortable for you to define dependencies between the resources. For example, I might want to deploy a web application with a backend database. But one of the inputs that goes into the web application might be, the database connection string. So to that end, there might be a dependency for you first to create the database and then to create the web app. And the database's connection string might be an output, and that output might become an input for the web application. The resource, this is kind of, staple for the resource manager. This is what it loves doing, right? It loves sort of managing those life cycle of resources, understanding that this needs to happen first and then that needs to happen, and interpreting your ARM templates in terms of what you want deployed. It also takes care of access control, right? So if you're applying a role-based access control to a certain level in the structure, it's actually the resource manager that implements that and is cognizant of those permissions of yours. It applies things like tags, right? It also clarifies your billing. If you were tagging resources for billing purposes, it is the resource manager that can provide that reporting capability, for you moving forward. The resource manager speaks a specific language, right? And it's not a language. It's not a language that's very, very easy to understand because it's an adjacent format, right? So it's readable, but there are probably better languages, if you like, for human readability at least. The ARM templates and everything that you deploy in Azure will be based on the ARM template. Uses a JSON format. It's got certain optional fields. It's got certain fields that are not optional. I'll go through that in a minute. But it essentially allows you to implement your infrastructure in a consistent fashion. Once again, consistency here is key, right? If you decide that you're going to deploy, say 500 web servers as virtual machines inside of Azure, you want to make sure that all those virtual machines are configured consistently, right? That they have the same sort of spec, the same type of configuration. And you want to ensure, in a sense, that, there's no configuration drift. We've got some tools for that as well, something like desired state configuration from PowerShell will ensure that there isn't configuration drift for your infrastructure and for your virtual machines. But OM templates is going to be your basis to start off with and actually start orchestrating your different deployments. Complex deployments or very simple deployments, it really doesn't matter. So I can use one of these OM templates and I can deploy 50 virtual machines if I wanted to with one single template deployment, or I can have 50 different templates that can essentially each deploy a virtual machine with its own configuration. Consistency is important. Repeatable results is key here. They can be modular, right? So in other words, I can have one template that provisions a storage account, and I can have another template that calls that template before it actually deploys the virtual machine, right? So I can have a parent-child type relationship defined between these templates. So one template does something relatively generic, and another template calls that template and does something quite specific. It is quite extensible via Bash and PowerShell. So in some cases, you might find administrators go and create some complex PowerShell scripts or Bash scripts for that matter, using our PowerShell integration with Azure, using the CLI for that matter. And from there, they end up deploying these resources from those command line tools, or even from the portal for that matter. OM templates promotes reuse, and this is really what you're trying to achieve here, right? You don't want every administrator in your organization to be deploying resources in their own unique way. That's when you get that inconsistency that we're trying to get away from. So templates, and especially centrally stored templates, will promote reuse in your environment, and that's what you want to get to, right? Is having a central repository where you've got a couple of templates and your administrators and developers just use these templates over and over and over again. If there's a change to the templates, you can go and redeploy them. I mentioned complex deployments, and I'll see if I can provide you with a complex deployment in a minute. Let's see if we can pull together some sort of a demo for this, right? I'm going to just navigate here and find I've got my template ready. So by the way, for those of you that are not sure, this is the Azure portal. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to bump the font slightly. Apologies for that font being so small. And then I'm going to go for create a resource. And the resource I'm going to be creating, I'm going to select template. All right. Hello, template. There we go. I can select a template deployment. And you'll notice that I can click on the create button, and it's going to prompt me now to either use some of the common templates that we've got already pre-packaged there, or alternatively, I can go and build my own template in the editor, right? And there you can see there's a very, very simple template. I won't really call this a template because there aren't any resources. The purpose of a resource manager template is to deploy resources. And if there aren't any resources, it's not doing anything really, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on load file here. I'm going to go for my documents folder, content, head off to my repos here, and I'm going to go find the Azure Administrator hands-on labs course. And there you can see I've got two different things there, right? The one is a template, and the other one is a parameter file, right? So two different files I'm going to choose from there. There's the template. I'm going to select the template, and you'll see immediately the scroll bar just shrinks all the way to that sort of size there. And you'll see in here that there suddenly is a huge amount of resources that I'm actually defining in here, right? So I'm going to click on the save button, and you'll see immediately that it's come back with some sort of a form here. We're basically inferring this form from the template. By the way, some of you might not be aware of this, but these forms are actually quite extensible. So if you wanted to, you can actually create some custom forms that you can deploy in your organization, and your organization can use these forms to deploy your resources, right? So we've got a framework behind these forms as well for doing that. I'm going to go for my dev resource group, and I'm going to create a new resource, subscription. I'm going to create a new resource group there called 10 Tuesdays, or TENT, as I like to abbreviate it. So there you can see I've got, the region, and of course I'm going to scroll to the bottom and select UK South. I'm going to change the size of the virtual machines. Let's go with that size there. Ooh. Let me just select a template size that I'm happy with. And I'm going to change the size. I'm going to search for that. And let me rather just select another subscription. There we go. That's going to work. I've got a policy. I've got a policy on the dev subscription that stops me from deploying certain size VMs, right? Great example of where policy says, sorry, you're not doing that. The resource manager template was very quick there, on its high horse going, sorry, this is not happening. So it's a good example of that. You will notice here that we've come up with a kind of a bogus username and password here. I didn't type that in. It wasn't there. But if I click on edit parameters and click on load file here, then you'll notice that there is a parameter file. If I click on OK there, this is the parameter file, and you'll see that there's a student and a slightly more complicated password. I'm going to hit the OK button, and I do need to go and just type that in there again. All right, so there you can see, again, I'm going to go for UK South. It's overwritten some of these values, but there you can see there's my username now, a student, and there's my password, that complex password that I showed you in a bit from the parameter file. The best way to describe parameters would be for something that you want to prompt the end user for, right? And we can map those to variables. I'll talk about that in a bit. So I'm going to click on review and create here. This will just take a second. I'm going to click on create. And my deployment is in progress. By the way, if I go for subscriptions here, you will see if I go for my always on subscription, scroll to the bottom here and click on deployments, you will see that all deployments are kind of able to reverse engineer to the template. So there you can see there's the template that was used for this, what looks like a Kubernetes cluster. There's the template. There's some of the parameters that were used, right? So you can see there it was, for a Azure DevOps course for that matter. Okay, so this template of mine is still busy being deployed. It'll take some time. It's going to deploy 4 virtual machines over 3 virtual networks. And we will get back to that momentarily. So coming back to this JSON template schema, you'll notice that we've got something called a content version, right? We can actually specify the specific schema. So as we roll things forward in Azure, we actually generate different versions of the schemas. So this is just a versioning strategy for us that we follow with these templates. And then following that, you'll notice that we've got a couple of additional fields there. First of all, we've got something called parameters. And as I mentioned, parameters are typically something that you're prompting the user for when they are adding the template, right? Username, password, database name, virtual machine name, all of those can be templates. Can be parameters. We also have something called variables, and variables are typically used when I want to reuse something, right? So think, for example, if I was creating 2 virtual machines, both on the same virtual network, I might want to prompt the user for the virtual network name and then map that virtual network name, the parameter, into the variable and reuse that network name as a variable throughout my template, right? So I can map certain parameters or just create a value as a variable and reuse that variable anywhere in my template. We've also got a functions area that I might use for, things like concatenating, values together. Think, for example, of generating a virtual machine name with a random sort of number behind it, etc. Those sort of things. And then we've got the resources section, and the resources section is the only field here that is actually required. All the rest of them are not required. The resource field is actually required. And from there, we've also got an output section, and you'll notice that the output section is essentially the outputs from this specific template. Good example of this is that database versus the connection string that I want to pass in for the web application I mentioned early on. Another example of this is the example where I might, as an example, create a web application, and I want to show the end user what the application URL is, for example, right? I can map the URL into an output, and this means that this is something that someone can actually go and read afterwards. We often use the outputs from one template as an input to another template, but very often we also just use it to show certain things that were actually provisioned and created. A name or something, the URL, the IP address, etc. All right, so that's on templates. So I'll get back to that in a bit. We're just briefly going to look at the two command line tools. Now I'm flying through this because I actually want to leave a little bit more time for questions towards the end today. So PowerShell. Some of you might be familiar with PowerShell. If you're coming from a Linux background, you might be more familiar with something like Bash, right? Which is the shell environment that you use in Linux. PowerShell tends to be more of a Windows type thing. We shipped this with Windows back in sort of the mid-2000s, right? We built this into Windows. It's actually a shell environment based on the Corn shell, which is also quite a well-known shell environment. But it's more than just a shell, right? It's a shell. It's a scripting language. It's got its own, almost like a scripting / domain specific language, if you like. It's also a runtime. So I can either open up a shell environment and run my scripts, or I can just take my script and just pass it to the runtime, and the runtime will run it. It will typically generate a shell as well, but the reality is PowerShell has got its own sort of runtime environment, right? That you can say, here's a script, execute the script. It's also modular, right? So Microsoft has started off with management capabilities, for example, for Windows, get process, etc. And we eventually sort of, moved more towards using PowerShell to manage other resources. And the reality is right now, if you're managing SQL Server, you can use PowerShell to manage SQL Server. If you're running something like SharePoint, you can use PowerShell to manage SharePoint. Most of our on-prem as well as cloud services has got a PowerShell module that you can use to actually manage those services and resources. So it's a great way for you to get some hands-on on command line tools, something that probably was lacking a little bit in the past on the Microsoft platform. But it is also available on non-Windows platforms right now. So if you're not familiar with this, from the .NET 3.11 or 3.12 core, we essentially made the .NET framework available cross-platform. So I can now run .NET applications on Linux, for example. And since we did that, we also managed to port PowerShell over to Linux. So I can install and run PowerShell now on my Linux environments as well, if that's something that is of interest to me. I've got an example here of a PowerShell script. The key here that you'll probably notice is I've got two variables here, resource group name and location, right? And resource group name is set to RD1, location is set to UK South. How do I know that this is a PowerShell script and not a Bash script? Well, if I make this blue, you'll notice that it starts with $, right? If I'm creating variables and assigning values like that in the Bash environment, I typically just specify the name of the variable is equal to and whatever the value might be, right? So I know that this is PowerShell because the variables have got $1 in front of them. And then I go off and I I create a new resource group, new AZ resource group, the name, passing in that parameter, of course, and the location, passing in that location. Very simple sort of scripting environment, right? Once the resource group has been created, I can go and create a new Azure virtual machine, new AZ VM, the resource group name, the name of the virtual machine, the image I'm planning to use, and the location. There might be some additional parameters required to create a virtual machine, but it's a relatively straightforward sort of thing, all right? I'm going to see if I can actually execute some PowerShell commands for you in a minute. Let me just drag this over. So what I've got now is I've got a command called get AZVM, and it's not showing me anything right now, likely because I've put this in my always on subscription, right? So my PowerShell here is actually connected to my other subscription, which is why it's not showing those virtual machines. Suffice to say, if I was to clear this out and specify a command called get command, you'll notice that generally PowerShell commands have got two parts to it, right? The first part, verb, get, set, update, for example, and the second part is typically a noun, right? So this tends to be a verb, and this part is usually a noun, okay? And this is a very consistent sort of command structure that we've got for PowerShell, right? So much so that the get command, which is a command that we can execute to enumerate commands, has got parameters. Show the commands where the verb is get and the noun, oopsie, starts with AZ, and put in a wildcard there. And you'll see that these are all the commands that start with get and that has got AZ as the command. If I, for example, change that to set, there's a list of all the commands. So you can use this get command to essentially explore a little bit and see, what commands are available. So, for example, if I have to say get AZ VMSS, get AZ VM virtual machine scale set, oops daisies, and it'll essentially return all the scale sets that I've got. I don't have any in the scope of that that specific item. All right, so there you can see my deployment is complete now from my PowerShell, from my ARM template, and there's all my virtual machines, right? If I order this by type, then you'll see there's virtual machine 1, virtual machine 2, all the way through virtual machine 3. And if I scroll up to the top here, you will see that there's a specific deployment. It's deploying some additional policies, by the way, but there you can see there's my template deployment. And it's essentially got that, it's got that resource template. I can click on template here, and you'll see that this is exactly the template as well as the parameters that I used for that template deployment. All right, so I just wanted to show you the actual virtual machines that were deployed via that template. I'm not going to continue with the PowerShell commands. I did not really plan to deploy any resources. Suffice to say, you can use this get command to actually enumerate some commands, be quite specific, and look and interrogate some of the services that you've got deployed. All right, so that's the PowerShell side of things. And PowerShell is one way of managing your resources, but it's not the only way of managing resources. So if you are more familiar with a Linux sort of operating system, you want to use something like Bash, but of course Bash doesn't have native integration into Azure like PowerShell has, right? That's something that Microsoft is building. Bash is not going to have that level of integration. So if you're coming from a non-Windows, non-Microsoft sort of background, you might say, but what command line tools can I use? Because my scripting language is Bash. What commands can I execute to manage my environment? And you need to look no further than something called the CLI, or the command line interface for Azure. This is a program that you can essentially install that'll be part of your path, right? As long as it's installed and part of your path, you can essentially start running commands against it, right? So it's got a top level of commands, and then there are some sub-commands and even more sub-commands and sub-commands underneath that. It's usually a lot less verbose than PowerShell. There you can see AZ VM restart, right? The resource group and the virtual machine name. But it usually takes a lot less text to do something with the CLI than what it takes with PowerShell. PowerShell tends to be a little bit more verbose, a lot more text, a lot more sort of, a lot more statements, etc. And we try to actually make things a little bit easier with the CLI, to be fair. I have to say though, on the opposite side of that fence, PowerShell tends to be a lot faster than the CLI, right? So even though there are some capabilities on the PowerShell side that we don't have on the CLI has got some capabilities that we don't have on PowerShell, right? So you can pivot that in both directions. But CLI is not remotely as fast as PowerShell. PowerShell is still the fastest way of interacting with the environment, right? And you can go and measure this out. It's pretty quick. The CLI tends to take a little bit longer to execute and actually interact with the environment. There's a pretty good example there of restarting a virtual machine, but if I go back to my environment here, you can see there, if I just type the word AZ, it'll essentially tell me what all the top level commands are. And if I go for AZ and group, just as an example, and type --help, then it will essentially tell me, hey, what are all the commands under AZ group, right? And you'll notice that I can then go and just type the word list, and it'll essentially list out the different the different resource groups in this instance. Okay, so this is how the CLI kind of does things. The CLI is going to have your top level commands, and if I just scroll up a little bit, you'll notice that there's, for example, web app, right? So same thing. If I go AZ web app --help, it's essentially going to show me all the commands just underneath that. And you'll notice that I can actually go and say AZ web app list. I don't think I've got anything in there. Web app list. I don't think I've got any web apps running there. So you'll see it's coming back with empty. But there you can see all the other sub commands. Start, restart, list the runtimes, etc., etc., etc. Okay. The CLI, as I mentioned, is just a program. It's installed in your path. So I don't need a PowerShell runtime to execute the CLI commands, right? So if I go and create a stock standard Windows command line, like I've got now, command prompt, you'll see that get command is not going to work here, right? This is the old Windows command line utility. It doesn't have PowerShell running. For me to run PowerShell in here, I have to first type PowerShell. But even in here, AZ, my CLI commands are available in here, right? AZ storage and type --help. It'll give me the sub commands, and you can see there that I can, specify AZ storage count, and then probably a list command underneath that, and it shows me my different commands underneath that. All right. So you can choose a combination of PowerShell and the CLI, or bash and the CLI, or you can just do everything in PowerShell if you wanted to and not even use the CLI, right? Some other benefits of PowerShell. PowerShell allows me to take the output from one command and add it to the input of another command. So this command will actually work quite well. Let me just type PowerShell here. Ooh. So that actually starts a PowerShell instance, clear that out. So I can say get AZ resource group, right? And it'll list out all the resource groups that I've got. There we go. There's those two resource groups. And I can actually go and take the output from that and pipe it into a remove AZ resource group and go and force that and run it as a job, just as an example, right? So I don't have this capability necessarily inside the CLI, because the CLI cannot pipe data between different commands, right? The PowerShell is quite powerful. It can do this. It can take the results from my first query and then pass that into my second command, and this will essentially allow me to remove all the resource groups that it's busy enumerating right now. So you'll probably never end up using just a single one of them. You'll probably always end up using a combination of these two. Something else I want to show quickly, and I'm going to go to GitHub. Ooh, that was a typo. There is GitHub, and this is my GitHub organization, and you'll see from there I've got a repo called course content, right? I might quickly just copy this link and share it with Rav on our chat here on the side. And Rav, you might be able to paste that in the chat window. But what I've got there is I've got some PowerShell scripts in there. And if you look at this PowerShell script here, AZ 104, you'll notice that, we've got the installation commands for installing the PowerShell, the installation commands for installing the CLI, how to authenticate using these different tools, and then, listing out all the virtual machine publishers and images in a certain region with CLI, doing the same with PowerShell, how to create a resource group, how to create a virtual machine with both PowerShell and this one. And you'll notice that there I can do a resource deployment that points it to a template file if I wanted to, using PowerShell. I can do the same with the Azure CLI, point it to the template file and do that deployment. And then last but not least, if I was using Bicep, which is relatively, well, it's not new really, but it's one of the ways to do this, then you will see that it can actually go and, there's the command, and I'll point it to my Bicep file and it'll do that import for me. If I also search for Azure template, if I actually search for anything related to Azure, storage accounts, web applications, and I search for the Bicep, you'll notice that what we've done quite recently is we've given you the for storage account, just as an example, there is the Bicep for provisioning a storage account. There is the ARM template for provisioning a storage account, if you want to use ARM templates, and there is the Terraform for provisioning a storage account. And this is true for everything else, right? There you can see, Azure Synapse, private link hubs, just as an example. There's the, there's the Terraform, there's the ARM, there's the Bicep. So we've got all of these. If you go to that link, learnMicrosoft.com in US Azure Templates, or if you just search for templates, it'll eventually take you to this link, and you will see that we've got a massive list of all our resources on the left-hand side that you can actually go and look at the exact bicep, ARM templates, or even Terraform, which we added quite recently in there to assist with your deployments. As per usual, we are asking you to go and fill out this form. There's the event ID is 17970, right? So if you scan this with your mobile phone, you'll be prompted to type your details, to type in the event ID, which is that 17970. Once you've typed that in, if you've attended 5 out of the last 7 sessions of this 10 Tuesdays, then you will get a 50% discount on your exam voucher if you wanted to go and register for the exam. All right. So don't let this opportunity pass you by. You can save a significant amount of money by, getting that 50% off. Just again, from my side, the event ID 17970 is the event ID. And we will do this one more time next week when we get to that. And then I've got 2 more sections here that I want to cover. The one is the Azure Portal. Now, I've been using the Azure Portal in these sessions quite extensively, right? You might be familiar with the Azure Portal. It's this environment here, right? And I can do almost everything from here that I can do from PowerShell or from the CLI. In fact, you can do certain things here that you cannot do from PowerShell and the CLI, right? One of the things I can do is I can actually switch directories, right? And if you'll notice here, I've got more than 1 directories that I can actually switch to, right? So it's easy to be doing that. But the important aspect here, and this is what I wanted to show you, is this item here, right? We've got this thing called the Cloud Shell. Now, of course, you would have noticed that my environment and my laptop here has actually got PowerShell installed. It's got the CLI installed. What if I'm sitting in an environment that I need to manage my Azure resources and I don't have the ability to install PowerShell or the CLI? How can I still manage my resources? Look no further than the Cloud Shell, right, which you can get to by clicking on that button there. It's first going to create a storage account for you. Once that storage account is created, we're going to give you this environment here, and you'll notice that the Cloud Shell has either got a Bash interface or it's got a PowerShell interface, right? So there you can see I can actually, if I wanted to, let me just go back to my repository here. There's that repository. All the commands that you might need to manage your environment. Think, for example, of Git, the Kubernetes command line tools, Docker. All of those commands are actually installed in the Cloud Shell already. So I can just go and type git clone, and because we give you persistent storage behind this, right, I can go and clone that repository, and if I do a ls here, you'll see that there is my course content, and if I cd course content there, and and then I can actually get to that PowerShell application. PowerShell folder that I had in that repository early on, and we've even got a little cloud-based and browser-based version of Visual Studio Code in here, right? So you can see there's that PowerShell script I had early on. The Cloud Shell has got this editor built into it, so you don't have to use things like VI, etc. We've got it running in both the Bash environment as well as in the PowerShell environment. I can upload files here if I wanted to, so I don't necessarily have to clone things. There's an upload button to upload or download files, but I can flip it over to PowerShell, hit the confirm button, and within a few seconds, you'll see I've got a PowerShell environment up and running, allowing me to start executing my PowerShell commands here. Get AZ resource group, just as an example, and I can hit the enter button, and there's my 2 resource groups that I showed you earlier on. Okay, so we've got the Azure Portal, graphical interface, web-based, and in the Azure Portal, we've got the Cloud Shell, and the Cloud Shell is a shell environment that you can access via your browser right there in the Azure Portal. Pretty cool if you ask me. And last but certainly not least, for managing hybrid resources, for managing resources in multi-cloud scenarios, we've got something called Azure Arc. Now, the Azure Arc is a relatively new service that we've got, and we keep expanding the resources that we can manage with Azure Arc. Suffice to say that if I had the following scenarios, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, I've got Azure, right? And inside Azure, I've got some virtual machines, right? VM1, VM2, just as an example, right? In my on-premises data center, I'd like to draw it like this. I might have some additional servers and VMs, right? Whether it's physical VMs, servers, I might also have something like Kubernetes running on premises. Azure Arc, I'm going to use the magic pen here. Azure Arc is going to essentially give me a management plane on my Kubernetes cluster, on my virtual machines or other physical servers on premises, so that I can manage everything both in Azure and on premises, or even in other cloud providers like AWS, so that I've got a single pane of glass to manage these resources. And all the sort of standard constructs for managing resources in Azure will be available for some of those services, right? So what is Azure Arc? Azure Arc is essentially a hybrid type connection that you can establish between your Azure environment and your on-prem and other cloud provider environments, that gives you some multi-cloud hybrid type management capabilities, right? So some of the cloud native patterns will be available for some of your resources on-prem, and you can manage all of servers, Kubernetes cluster, Azure data services, SQL Server, for example, and even virtual machines now are in preview, right? And it doesn't matter what flavor of operating system. I thought I might just quickly give you an example of this. There's Azure Arc, and you'll notice that I can actually go and specify my custom locations, and I can go and create custom locations, right? There you can see, some of the basics, the resource group, the custom location name, the cluster, if I wanted to specify the cluster, etc., etc. And then you'll see, if I just scroll down a section, there's, my Kubernetes clusters, Arc virtual machines that I want to be managing from the cloud that might be sitting on-prem or in another cloud provider's data center, VMware, vCenters, and a whole bunch of additional services like servers, SQL servers, etc., etc. And you'll also notice SQL managed instances, and also PostgreSQL is under preview right now. So Azure Arc is a great way for you to essentially extend your cloud management capabilities to wherever your resources are living. And I managed to quite easily set up a connection, an Arc connection between Azure and the Kubernetes cluster that I had running locally on my laptop here, right? So it's not rocket science to do this. It took me about 30 minutes, and I've never done it before. So if I can do it, essentially anyone can do it, I firmly believe. And that brings me to, just a brief summary of what we spoke about today. I hope that was useful for you. We spoke about lots of different tools that will assist you to manage some of your resources, some command line tools like PowerShell and the CLI, and even the Cloud Shell for that matter, as well as the graphical interface and the Azure Portal, as well as Azure Arc for some of your on-prem and multi-cloud or hybrid type scenarios. And that brings me to the end of this session. I hope that this was valuable for you. I want to see if there are any questions.
So I'm just going from the top. I think the first question we have is from Vic. Is it safe to say use PowerShell over CLI almost always, and that CLI is a lightweight PS?
Actually not, Vic. So there will be certain instances where you probably will use both of these, right? I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by that. If I go back to this PowerShell script that I had earlier on, right? If I scroll to the bottom here, you'll see I've got a section here where I'm essentially configuring a network security group, right, to open up a port so that I can access my virtual machine via port 80. If you look at the complexity of that script, you can probably whittle that down to like 3 or 4 lines of code, right? But it is quite verbose. Contrast that with the CLI command. It's like AZ VM open port, specify the port, the resource group name, and the name of the VM. Does exactly the same thing. The one is the PowerShell side, the other one is the CLI. PowerShell is a shell environment, right? It's got its own shell. CLI is not a shell. It's just a program that's installed in your path. It's executable on Windows that you can execute. So it's not the same thing. Now, you can either go and churn out these reams of code for PowerShell, or you can have a PowerShell that goes into a loop and, for example, just executes the CLI command once, and you're going to go down from code that's 15 lines long to code that's essentially 2 lines long, right? So horses for courses here. If speed is what you're after, PowerShell might be the way to go. If you don't care too much about speed, and realistically, if you're doing things from the command line, speed is not the biggest thing for you, right? It's probably more important to have less complex scripts. And to that end, the CLI might be your go-to tool, right? So I hope that answered the question, right? It's not a lightweight PowerShell. It has nothing to do with PowerShell. I ran it there from the Windows command line tools. I hope that answers the question. Any other questions?
So I think that was the only question we had today.
Christmas comes early.
Yeah.
So I see there is one more question there.
Oh, yes.
Thanks, Kevin. Adding on, what AZ certification test for proficiency in CLI and PowerShell? All our role-based courses does that, right? Our developer course will test your PowerShell and CLI capabilities. There's not a specific exam and certification based on that. It's embedded in all our certifications and exams. So if you are doing the administrator course, every module will have some PowerShell and CLI questions in there. If you're doing the developer course, everyone. If you're doing the AZ700, the networking certification, there'll be some PowerShell and CLI in there. So we kind of sprinkle it all over our certifications. It's not a specific certification that tests for that. That said, you will find some learning paths on our Learn portal that will specifically teach you the CLI and specifically teach you Azure PowerShell for that matter. So I hope that helps. And I do think that is the only question. Gosh, that felt really, really quick, ladies and gents. I hope that was valuable for you. I'm going to bring it to an end here. There's not really much that I wanted to cover in addition to that. So from my side, thank you very much for the questions. Thanks for listening, and I hope that was valuable to all of you. Thanks, Rav, again for all your assistance and help, and we will chat with you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.